The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands, if millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the 5th day of this January 2020, 7-day sesshin here at snowy Mountain Gate. Although the snow is fast melting because the sun is out and the wind is high. Today we will continue sharing from this amazing book, No Self, No Problem, How Neuropsychology is Catching Up to Buddhism, by Chris Niebauer, PhD, who is a professor at Slippery Rock University in Pennsylvania. And it's a brand new book. It was just published this past year. And it is something that everyone who has any interest, well, not just interest in Zen, but interest in human behavior, interest in becoming a more awakened person, whether through Zen or some other form, it should read. It is revolutionary, really, but as he points out many times in the text, it just reiterates what we've been told and taught in Buddhism from ancient times. No self, no problem. And we've reached chapter 3 now, which is titled Pattern Perception and the Missing Self, with the quote from Nisargadatta Maharaj: "Identity is merely a pattern of events in time and space. Change the pattern and you've changed the person." And perhaps we all have known people who have had sudden radical changes in their life. Something major has happened, severe illness or the death of somebody or some buddies that really impacted them, and how that changed that person. There are many stories of people who've gone through extremity and come out the other end transforming into people who made their life work, that which was beneficial to society. There's also, in a book called by Catherine Delling Singh, The Grace in Dying, she speaks of a number of instances in which people who were irascible during their life, in the last few days or the last few hours before they actually died, they suddenly changed personality radically and became loving, kind, compassionate, sharing, open human beings, whereas they spent a life being the opposite. So, which was the real person? There are a couple of koans that speak to this in our Zen practice. One is Sei and her soul are separated, and part of the koan reads, which is the real person? The story, of course, is where it's an ancient Chinese tale in which a young woman grows up with a young neighbor boy, and they were so compatible that their parents used to joke and say that they would become married as they got old enough to do so. And then what happened was that, of course, it was an era of arranged marriage, and Dad arranged marriage to somebody totally strange. And this was an enormous shock to Sei, the girl. And in fact, she fell into a deep depression, took to her bed, and didn't emerge, wouldn't speak, wouldn't talk. And the guy she was thought she was going to marry, the one she was in love with, was so bereft by this news that she was being promised to somebody else that he left. And he decided to leave the area. And so he went to the river and got on a boat and was going down the river on a boat when suddenly he sees this figure running alongside the shore, and it's Say, and he's overjoyed. She's come to join him. She's run away from home. She's come to join him. And she does. And they sail away and live for a number of years, have a couple of kids. And then Say starts getting a little homesick. And so they decide to go back and apologize to her father for having run away and make amends and see her family again. So they go back. And in order to be careful about this, her husband goes first to the house, leaving her with the children on the boat. And he's welcomed into the household, and he says to his father-in-law, who doesn't know he's his father-in-law at that point, I have to apologize for taking Say away from you. And the father says, what do you mean take her away? She's in the back bedroom. She hasn't spoken since the day you left. And at that moment, the Say that was in the back bedroom gets up out of bed, goes. In the meantime, the other Say has come from the boat with the kids, and when the two Says see each other, they embrace and merge and become one. Which was the real Say? Who is the real Say? Who's the real me? Well, let's get into this book. In the last chapter, we looked at a few of the tools of the interpreter: language, categorization, beliefs, and judgment. The left brain uses these tools in such a way that we could say it is really something of a pattern-making machine. In fact, I would argue that it is the most advanced pattern perception machine in the cosmos. And then he speaks about pattern in the role of language. And that I'd already mentioned that earlier, that without patterns, without the left brain able to see patterns and to categorize things, we would not be able to communicate with language. You have to have language because language happens to be pattern recognition, no matter what language it is. And then he continues, just like categories and beliefs, most of us have completely forgotten that patterns only exist in the mind and not out in reality. As you already point out, we have this word for this thing that I'm sitting on called chair, and it's an arbitrary construction. It's something that people have agreed to call this thing that I'm sitting on. But he also had said that, it could also have been called a lemon. And if everybody agreed that I was sitting on a lemon, then it would be a lemon, at least in people's minds, ignoring what lemon calls to mind for all of you. But is this thing I'm sitting on actually a chair? Or is it a construction put together that we have named chair? And he talks about how reading would not be possible without being able to recognize patterns. And grammar, language in general, spelling, all that comes up of language, whether it's written or spoken, but is the word what the thing is? Psychology's first formal recognition of the pattern-perceiving part of the brain was likely due to the work of Dr. Hermann Rorschach, who created the famous ink blot test back in the 1920s. In a Rorschach test, a subject is presented with an ink blot and asked to take a look and say what they see in the image. You can try this for yourself. And he's got an example. And then he says, this is called a projective test because it was believed at the time of its creation that patients would project any inner or unconscious issues on the random ink blot. But what Rorschach had really discovered was that the pattern perceiver could always make sense of randomness and see something. The main issue with this test is that while a patient may expose certain tendencies of their pattern perceiver, this is only processed by yet another pattern perceiver in the therapist. While seeing patterns that aren't there, as in the Rorschach test, can seem innocuous, upon closer inspection it may provide us with a hint of how the left brain created our sense of self by seeing a pattern that isn't there. In other words, perhaps our pattern perceiving machine looks within and finds a single point of perception, remembers a series of likes and dislikes, judgments, beliefs, etc., and creates the pattern of me, quote unquote. Identifying patterns is a helpful and necessary tool to navigate the world in many ways, but it is also true that by constantly looking for patterns, the left brain complicates what is perceived in a way that can be unnecessary and unhelpful. For instance, one study involved a simple test where viewers guessed whether a light was going to appear on the top or bottom of a computer screen. Unbeknownst to the subjects, in the test, the image randomly appeared on the top 80% of the time. Most everyone quickly deduced that it appeared on the top more often, but because the left brain is constantly looking to, quote, solve the puzzle, close quote, it tried to find a solid pattern in the random occurrences. As a result, the subjects only guessed correctly about 68% of the time. That number may still sound impressive, but when the test was repeated with rats, which lack our complicated pattern-seeking interpreter, the rats always picked the top, so they guessed correctly 80% of the time. This is a perfect example of the interpreter spending time trying to find a pattern for a story that doesn't exist. So in this case, the left brain lost when compared to rats. And most interestingly, none of the participants had the slightest clue that they were creating patterns that were not there. By seeing patterns that are not there, the mind creates stories that aren't true. And as we've previously discussed, this can lead to unnecessary suffering, anxiety, and depression. And he had talked earlier about a friend of his who went into a deep depression when she thought that her workmates were disliking her. And it was because she witnessed them huddled in the corner whispering to one another, and her left brain surmised a pattern, namely they were plotting against her. She experienced a wave of sadness, fear, anxiety, and so on, and spent a good amount of time agonizing over it. But later, she found out they were planning a surprise birthday party for her instead. While this example may seem trivial, I invite you to notice how your own left brain sees patterns that later turn out to not be there, which is the same as creating mental stories about events that just aren't true. And we do that all the time. We jump to conclusions about what someone is saying and what their motives are behind what they are saying and who they are and why they are saying that. And we react based on our perception, misperception really, of this, and a whole complicated interaction takes place, none of which is accurate or true. And so you can see how people can not only cause but involve themselves in a great deal of suffering because of this pattern-making aspect of the left brain. Now, again, this is not something to be gotten rid of. If we got rid of it, we wouldn't be able to talk because what would come out would be gibberish and nobody would understand us. Patterns are important. The left brain has a critical role in life. The problem is we take it to be real, what it comes up with, those stories, those patterns. Sure, it's fun to do a puzzle, to put the pieces together. We have our pattern-making ability to thank for that one, for the joy of several hours, perhaps. But in terms of our interactions with each other and the assumptions that we draw about other people, situations, and so on, I mean, we're seeing this in a major way in politics right now. And it's causing innumerable amounts of suffering. He continues, there's also some evidence that neurotransmitters affect our pattern perception capability. Because of this, it's important to note that the two sides of the brain differ in terms of their neurochemistry, which is an interesting thing. The left brain is dominant for dopamine, whereas the right brain is dominant for serotonin or norepinephrine. There are many functions associated with dopamine that range from the euphoria of falling in love to the movements of the body. Since the 1950s, it was also been thought that schizophrenia is the result of too much dopamine. One of the hallmarks of schizophrenia is seeing patterns that are not there, that is to say, hallucinations. One fascinating study found that subjects who had an increased amount of dopamine were more likely to find patterns. The study used two groups of subjects. One group was comprised of people with a propensity to see patterns in random images. They were called the believers. The other was made up of people who looked at the same random images and almost never saw patterns. They were called the skeptics. In the experiment, the two groups were shown images from which they had to detect if they were being shown a real word or face or a scrambled word or face. Both groups made mistakes. The believers saw patterns when there were none, and the skeptics often missed when a real face or word was on the screen. When dopamine was increased in both groups, the skeptics started to make the mistake of seeing patterns when there were none. Dopamine turned up the perception of patterns even when no patterns were present. When the dopamine wore off, the skeptics' left brain went back to normal, as did their responses. Another interesting thing uncovered in pattern perception research is how a participant's tendency to see patterns increased when the researchers threatened the participant's sense of self. It's almost as if when we feel threatened, we jump to clinging to something that will make us feel safe, even in the face of the threat. And it's an interesting way they came up with this experiment. In one such study, researchers presented participants with a picture made up simply of visual noise. In other words, random variations of brightness and colors, either at a time when they felt safe or right before they jumped out of a plane. The act of jumping out of a plane presents an acute fear that the pattern known as the self may soon come to an end. Those about to jump were more likely to believe that they saw a pattern in the randomness, numbers embedded in the random noise, versus the control group. The tendency of the self to defend its own image through more thinking is a hallmark of understanding in Buddhism. Experienced meditators describe how in meditation, as the mind begins to still and the voice in the head speaks less frequently, there is often a rush of thoughts that are most important to sustaining the self-image. Let's read that again. Experienced meditators describe how in meditation, as the mind begins to still and the voice in the head speaks less frequently, which when it first begins to happen, people are quite happy about that, until frequently there's often a rush of thoughts that are most important to sustaining the self-image, and suddenly our hopes are dashed, all because of pattern making. This is how meditators can notice what mental stories and thought patterns are their most prevalent preoccupations, as the mind reverts to replaying these topics as a defense against slowing down. Some Eastern teachers explain that the mind, quote, keeps talking, close quote, in this way because it's the only way it can exist. This is consistent with my view that the self is more like a verb than a noun. It only exists when we think it does, because the process of thinking creates it. And that's why when we reach that point in our practice where the mind has begun to settle down and thoughts are less frequent, and then suddenly we have a rush of thoughts, it's important to drop beneath the level of thoughts, as if you were going into the ocean, and first you're up in the waves, the thoughts, and then you drop deep. You've got this diving suit on, and you just drop deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the silence of the depths of the ocean. That's how to work with this. The combination of these studies in neuropsychology and Buddhist teaching suggests that when the pattern of the self feels threatened or exposed, thinking shifts in a way to support a new or reinterpreted version of itself. You can quickly examine this idea for yourself. For instance, have you ever felt a threat to your ego? Ever felt stupid or embarrassed? In those moments, your sense of self wasn't as secure as you thought it was. So you likely shifted and reinterpreted the events to account for the unexpected change. This reinterpretation or reinvesting can happen in a variety of ways. You may do anything from discounting others, in other words, their opinion is of no value, to refocusing your identity another way. Well, I may not be as rich as they are, but I am much smarter. Or focus on how patriotic you are, or how spiritual, or how any other prized pattern of the self that compensates for the area in which your ego felt threatened. From a neuropsychological perspective, we could say that all of these defenses are caused by the left brain mechanism readjusting to unexpected pattern changes. And there are values in that activity of the brain, not necessarily in terms of dealing with embarrassment or shame, but if suddenly there's a change, a roadblock in the road of life as you're going down that road, then the ability to change, to shift, to perceive a new pattern can be life-saving, and you can move on then. There are people who do get stuck at certain points in their lives or at certain situations in their lives and hammer on it for a long, long time. They cling to it almost as an alternative to shifting and changing. So in this sense, our left brain mechanism of pattern perception and pattern creation can be helpful. So this is not 100% negative by any means. There are benefits to this left brain ability to see patterns, but there are also drawbacks in terms of the fact that in seeing these patterns and investing in these patterns, we put ourselves on a road to suffering and creating suffering. And that is what our practice is about, is seeing through these patterns, seeing through this tendency to create patterns, and recognizing that this creation is just an idea. It's not accurate. And here I think I will stop and shift gears, speaking of that, and take up as an example of this a koan in the Mumon koan. This is koan number 12, titled Zui-gan Calls Master. And the main case is that Zui-gan, who is a Chinese master in the Tang Dynasty, I believe, every day he says, to himself, "Master, Master," and answers himself, "Yes, yes." And then he answers his answer and says, "Don't be deceived, don't be deceived." And then responds, "I won't, I won't." We have so many faces. And Professor Niebauer gets into this later in the same chapter, by the way, where he talks about how you can do an experiment. If you think there's a solid self, go through the next 24 hours. I wouldn't necessarily advise this in sesshin, but what the hey, go ahead. And notice each time you're in a different mind state. Which one is the true you? Is it the one that may be a little irritated because you're not getting as much sleep? Or is it the one that is delighting in the sunshine here in northern New Mexico, even in January? Is it the one that is finding oneself deep in practice? How many yous are there? So, as part of the commentary, the Master Zhigan himself sells and himself buys. This, by the way, is from R.H. Blythe's translation of the Momonkan. The Master Zhigan himself sells and himself buys. He has a lot of puppets of gods and devils that he plays with. For what reason? Look and see, a calling one, an answering one that says, "Awake," a one that will not be looked down on. But you must not stick to these appearances, for that is your former mistake. And imitating others, like Zhigan, is only the mental disguise of a fox. This is exactly what Professor Niebauer is pointing at. We can continue a little bit further here. In 2006, Doctors Travis Pro and Steven Heine reviewed research across various disciplines to describe exactly what happens when a belief is threatened. What they concluded was that when this occurs, humans turn to other beliefs and increase their intensity. As they put it, quote, "When committed beliefs are violated, people experience an arousal state that prompts them to affirm other beliefs to which they are committed," close quote. The authors reported that study after study had the same finding. When the reality of one pattern is challenged, subjects would increase their belief in some other pattern to compensate. That is, when the belief in the safety and security of the self was challenged, another form of self-identity increases. I experienced this myself recently when I attended a gathering of about 80 faculty members at my university. I wasn't sure of the purpose of the gathering and didn't pay much attention to the opening remarks. Without thinking, I stood up and introduced myself to those around me. After only 3 seconds, I realized that no one was introducing themselves and that I was stuck in a rather absurd moment. As I sat down, my interpreter lost it. The voice in my head kept trying to redirect to other familiar patterns in my life, such as family or friends, in order to minimize this existential anxiety and to keep me from thinking too hard about what it perceived as a threat to my, quote, self, close quote, or, quote, self-worth, close quote, aka embarrassment. There are other times in ordinary life that the pattern perceiver runs across an unexplainable anomaly in our behavior or doing something we may describe as out of character, close quote. But figuring out why could take too much time and effort to work into the grand pattern of self. In these instances, the left brain may simply dismiss them as times in which we are, quote, not ourselves, close quote, or something has, quote, come over us, close quote. Most often we simply leave these anomalies a mystery, soon forgotten as the single grand pattern comes back online. The point of all this is to make clear to you that sitting upon your shoulders is the most advanced pattern perception machine in the known universe, and that it goes almost completely unappreciated. Even computers with the most advanced AI cannot match the pattern perception of the average human. We are seeing patterns, categorizing things, even creating a language to describe these patterns, all at lightning speed. Now consider again what happens when such a powerful pattern perception machine turns inward. Was there ever a chance it wouldn't, quote, find, close quote, a self, an ego, a consistent something out of the thoughts and mental reactions that occur in your brain? Is it possible that the missing self, the one that neuropsychology can't find and the Buddha says doesn't exist, is a mirage created by the very mechanisms of the brain itself? An interesting experiment to find out might be to give AI all of the qualities of the left brain and then turn it loose. I believe that eventually it too would look within and believe that it has a self. And lastly, I want to add that this pattern perception machine in the left brain is a biological function that is working all the time and virtually impossible to stop. That being said, simply by becoming aware of the left brain's propensity to see patterns, we can begin to take them less seriously. This has significant benefits for how we experience the world, including reducing our suffering. And as we deepen our practice, that is something that we can awaken to. That maybe there isn't somebody there. Maybe that it's all a series of thoughts gathered together. Mitra-roshi spoke of reality, quote, our perception of reality, being missed, that it was like a movie. A movie is not a solid thing. It expresses something in a series of individual frames. And yet, because these frames go so fast, we see it as a living, breathing situation unfolding. And it's like that. Take a moment, as I said earlier, and really take a look. Do you feel the same in this very moment as you felt at breakfast? Do you feel the same in the very moment as you did last year at this time? And if not, who are you? Where is the self that you think is so solid? Keep searching, because when you awaken to the truth of this, and he's spelled it out in words, really, and that's words. And it may help inspire us, but it won't provide the liberation that realizing it for ourselves will. And it's realizing it for ourselves that is the whole purpose of this practice. That who we think we are is just who we think we are. So, which one is the real say? Who am I? Show me that face before your parents were born. Thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.